10 years before the oceans brought the end of the world, the sky above Mexico began to bleed. It started as a whisper among the priests, a terrifying rumor that spread through the marketplaces of Tenochtitlan, the shimmering capital of the Aztec Empire. Every night, a jagged streak of fire, a comet, would rip across the heavens, refusing to set, hanging there like an open wound. To the Aztec people, who lived in a universe governed by the terrified belief that the sun would die if not fed with blood, this was not a weather phenomenon, it was a cosmic eviction notice. The Emperor Montezuma II, a man trained as a high priest and a warrior, spent his nights staring at that burning omen, paralyzed by an ancient prophecy. The legend said that Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, had been driven away to the east long ago, but he had promised to return in the year 1 Reed to reclaim his throne and end the current age. By a stroke of cosmic irony that defies all statistical probability, the year 1519 was the year 1 Reed. And in 1519, the messengers came running from the coast, breathless and pale, carrying news that would shatter their reality. Floating mountains had appeared on the eastern horizon, carrying men made of iron who commanded thunder and rode monster deer. The gods had returned, and they were hungry. But these were not gods. They were perhaps the most desperate men on the face of the earth. Leading them was Hernán Cortés, a 34-year-old Spanish lawyer turned rogue adventurer. He was not a general sent by the King of Spain. He was a mutineer. He had sailed from Cuba in direct violation of orders, and he knew that if he returned empty-handed, he would be hanged for treason. When his small army of 500 men landed on the sweltering coast of Veracruz, they were terrified. They were outnumbered thousands to one in a hostile jungle empire. They wanted to go back. In a moment of madness or genius that would define his legacy, Cortés ordered his own ships to be scuttled, sunk to the bottom of the ocean. As the wooden hulls disappeared beneath the waves, 500 men stood on the beach in silence, realizing the horrifying truth. There was no way home. The only way out was through the heart of the Aztec Empire. They had to conquer or die. As the Spanish began their march inland, they discovered that the Aztec Empire was not a monolithic block, but a fragile tyranny held together by fear. The Aztecs demanded heavy taxes and human sacrifices from the tribes they conquered. Cortés, with the cunning of a politician, realized he didn't need to fight the entire country. He just needed to break the chain. He found an unlikely weapon, not a cannon or a sword, but a teenage girl named Malinche, later known as La Malinche. She was a brilliant linguist, enslaved by the Maya, but born an Aztec noble. She could speak the language of the conquerors and the conquered. She became Cortés's voice, his strategist, and his lover. Through her, Cortés whispered promises of freedom to the enemies of the Aztecs. The most ferocious of these were the Tlaxcalans, a warrior nation that had resisted Aztec rule for generations. After a brutal initial battle where Spanish steel met obsidian blades, the Tlaxcalans realized these ironclad strangers could be the tool they had prayed for. They joined forces. The march to the capital was no longer 500 Spaniards. It was a rolling avalanche of thousands of indigenous warriors marching toward the center of the world. On November 8, 1519, the history of the world held its breath. The Spanish force crested the mountains and looked down into the Valley of Mexico. What they saw stunned them into silence. Shimmering in the middle of a vast mirror-like lake was Tenochtitlan. It was an engineering marvel larger than London, Paris, or Rome. It was a city of floating gardens, botanical zoos, and massive white pyramids that seemed to touch the sky. It was connected to the mainland by 3 massive causeways, marvels of stone masonry. One Spanish soldier wrote in his diary, "We did not know if what we saw was real or a dream." They descended into the lion's den, marching across the causeway into the heart of the city. The meeting between Montezuma and Cortés was a collision of 2 alien worlds. Montezuma arrived on a litter draped in gold and the iridescent blue-green feathers of the quetzal bird. He stepped down to greet Cortés, treating him with the reverence due to a divine ambassador. The emperor offered them gifts of gold, huge shimmering discs of the sun, which only fueled the Spanish lust. "We suffer from a disease of the heart that can only be cured by gold," Cortés famously told him. But the hospitality was a mask for terror. Montezuma was paralyzed by the prophecy, unsure if he was facing a man or a god. Cortés, sensing this hesitation, made a move of breathtaking audacity. In the middle of the polite diplomatic visits, he seized the emperor in his own palace, holding him at knife point. For 6 months, the Spanish ruled the empire through their royal hostage, looting the treasury and melting down centuries of artistic heritage into gold bars.
The city became a pressure cooker. The Aztec people watched in horror as their gods were mocked and their emperor turned into a puppet. The tension finally snapped when Cortés had to leave the city briefly to fight a Spanish rival sent to arrest him. He left his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge. Alvarado was a man of violence, not subtlety. During the festival of Tenochtitlan, while the Aztec nobility were dancing in the temple precinct unarmed, Alvarado panicked. Fearing an uprising, he ordered the gates closed and his men to slaughter the dancers. The pavement ran slick with the blood of the empire's best and brightest. When Cortés returned, he found the city in open revolt. The illusion of control was gone. The Aztec warriors, no longer paralyzed by superstition, attacked with the fury of a wounded jaguar. They cut the causeways, trapping the Spanish on the island. In a desperate bid to quell the riot, the Spanish dragged Montezuma to the rooftop of the palace to speak to his people. But the spell was broken. The crowd jeered at their former god-king. Stones flew from the mob. Montezuma was struck. Whether by a Spanish dagger or an Aztec stone, remains one of history's great mysteries. And days later, the emperor was dead. With their hostage gone, the Spanish had no shield. They were trapped in a city of enemies with no food, no water, and the bridges cut. They decided to break out on the rainy night of July 1, 1520. This event would be etched into history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Spanish built a makeshift portable bridge to cross the gaps in the causeway. In the dead of night, amidst a torrential downpour, they crept out of the palace. But greed would be their undoing. The soldiers, ignoring Cortés's orders to travel light, had laden themselves with pounds of stolen gold. They stuffed it into their armor, their boots, and their pockets. They made it to the first gap in the causeway when a woman drawing water saw them. Her scream pierced the night, followed by the deep, booming sound of the war drums from the temple pyramid, a sound soldiers later said sounded like the heartbeat of the devil. Instantly, the lake came alive. Thousands of canoes swarmed the causeway. Arrows and stones rained down like hail. The Spanish tried to cross their portable bridge, but the mud and the weight of the horses caused it to get stuck. They were trapped. The massacre was absolute. The Spanish were driven into the water. Those weighed down by the gold they refused to abandon sank like stones, drowning in the dark waters of the lake, dragging their fortunes to the bottom of history. Others were grabbed alive, dragged into canoes to be sacrificed to the war god Huitzilopochtli. Cortés, wounded and weeping, barely made it to the mainland. He sat under a cypress tree and watched the distant fires of the temple, hearing the screams of his captured comrades as their hearts were offered to the stars. 2/3 of his army was gone. It seemed the Aztec Empire had won. But the Spanish had left behind a weapon far more deadly than steel. As the Aztecs celebrated their victory and cleaned the blood from their temples, people began to fall ill. They developed fevers, and their skin erupted in terrible sores. It was smallpox. The disease, which had existed in Europe for centuries, was entirely new to the Americas. The indigenous immune system had no defense. It tore through Tenochtitlan like a wildfire, killing the new emperor, the generals, and nearly half the population. The chain of command collapsed. The farmers died, leaving the fields untended. While the city choked on death, Cortés was rebuilding. He did not flee to Spain, he fueled his rage. He built a navy of 13 brigantines, warships in the mountains of Tlaxcala, and carried them piece by piece to the lake. 1 year later, Cortés returned. He laid siege to Tenochtitlan, cutting off the aqueducts that brought fresh water. For 93 days, the Aztecs held out. They drank the salty water of the lake. They ate lizards, leather, and the bark of trees, but they would not surrender. The fighting was house to house, a brutal meat grinder. Finally, on August 13, 1521, the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured in a canoe while trying to escape to organize a resistance. He was brought before Cortés. He touched the dagger on Cortés's belt and said, "I have done everything I could to defend my people. I can do no more. Kill me now." The silence that fell over the Valley of Mexico that day was heavy and absolute. The great markets were empty. The pyramids were smoking ruins. The fifth sun had set. The collision of these two worlds birthed a new one, modern Mexico, built literally on top of the ruins of the old. The stones of the great Aztec temple were used to build the cathedral that stands in Mexico City today. It is a story of adventure and apocalypse, reminding us that civilizations are fragile things, and that the course of history can turn on the flight of a bird, the appearance of a comet, or the greed of a few desperate men.